You know, the Great Rebellion of 1857, it didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It was really the explosive finale to almost 100 years of simmering anger. Today, we're going to look at the long fuse that lit that fire, the decades of peasant movements that really set the stage for India's first war of independence.
Okay, so let's just start with the most basic question, right? Before we get into all the battles and the leaders, what does it actually take to push ordinary people, farmers, weavers, you name it, to take up arms against a massive, powerful empire?
So our story begins on what we're calling the road to resistance. Because you got to understand, these uprisings weren't just random acts of violence. Not at all. They were a direct response to some very specific, and I mean very oppressive conditions. So what was driving all this? Well, it was a pretty potent mix. You had this deep, deep anger against the whole feudal landlord system, and that was often mixed with some really powerful religious feelings. Meanwhile, the British East India Company was just systematically draining Bengal of its wealth with these brutal tax collection policies. So the goal wasn't just about getting rid of one bad landlord, it was about total freedom from colonial rule itself.
And check this out. This timeline shows it all so clearly. This was not a one-time thing. From the Fakir Sananasi resistance way back in the late 1700s, all the way through Titamir's rebellion, the Faraisi movement, and the huge Sandal rebellion, you can see this constant escalating pattern of resistance. Each one kind of building on the last, all of them pointing straight towards 1857.
So to really get how this pattern builds, let's zoom in on our first case study, the Barasat Uprising. It was led by a man who perfectly blended religious faith with, well, revolutionary fury, Titu Mir.
So here he is, Syed Mir Nisar Ali, but everyone knew him as Titu Mir. What he did was take these Wahhabi teachings about purifying Islam and channel that energy directly into an anti-landlord movement. And yeah, a lot of the powerful landlords were Hindus, so they were a main target. But Titu Mir's forces also went after any Muslim zamindars who wouldn't join the cause. So you see, this was as much about class and oppression as it was about religion.
All right, next up we have the Faraisi movement. And this one was built on an even more radical idea, one that struck right at the heart of the whole colonial system.
This was started by Haji Shariatullah, and his message was incredibly simple but so powerful. God owns the land. And if God owns the land, well then no zimmidar, no company, nobody has the right to tax it. The simple idea of religious equality just lit a fire under the Muslim peasantry and put them on a direct collision course with the authorities.
After Shariatullah died, his son, Dudu Miah, just took things to a whole other level. I mean, he wasn't just preaching anymore. He was building a state within a state. He organized East Bengal into zones run by his own leaders. He set up his own justice system. And crucially, he went right after the economic engine of the British in that area, the indigo planters. That's actually what got him arrested. His followers burned down an indigo factory in 1846.
But maybe the most incredible uprising before 1857 was the Santal Rebellion. Now this was something else. This wasn't just a local protest. We're talking a full-scale tribal war against the whole system of moneylenders, landlords, and tax collectors.
Just take a second and let that number sink in. 30,000. That's roughly how big the Santal army was. This was no small skirmish, right? This was a massive, organized force, totally driven by years of desperation and this powerful need to get their land and their dignity back.
And wow, this image really captures the ferocity of it all. It was led by two brothers, Sidhu and Kanhu. The Santals, using traditional weapons like axes and poisoned arrows, went on the attack. What started out as a peasant revolt against local bullies quickly turned into a fierce anti-British war that the company had to use overwhelming military force to put down.
So you see all these uprisings, Titu Mirs, the Faraisis, the Santals, think of them like sparks flying in a really, really dry forest. Well, in 1857, all those sparks finally hit at the same time, and the whole subcontinent it went up in flames.
And this is the moment we all know, right? The First War of Independence. But the key thing to get here is that this wasn't just a sepoy mutiny. No way. This was the moment that all that widespread, simmering anger we've been tracking finally boiled over and merged into one massive inferno.
So, how did it all come together? Well, it really came down to a shared anger, even if the specifics were a bit different. Over on one side, you've got the peasants with their long-standing problems, crushing taxes, losing their land, being exploited. And on the other side, you've got the sepoys with their own list of complaints, unequal pay, racism, and then that final trigger,
the greased cartridges that offended both Hindus and Muslims. You see the common thread? Both groups were victims of the exact same oppressive colonial system.
And that really brings us to the most important takeaway of all. The rebellion wasn't just soldiers fighting soldiers. It was a popular uprising. It drew in landlords, merchants, and the very same peasant farmers who had been fighting these smaller battles for decades.
In the end, though, the British military was just too strong. They crushed the rebellion. The old ways of armed fighting were brutally suppressed. But from the ashes of that conflict, something totally new started to grow. A new, educated middle class began to emerge, and they were ready to take up the fight for freedom in a whole new way.
Which leads us to our final question. The armed rebellions had been defeated, sure, but that spirit of resistance, it was stronger than ever. So the question I want to leave you with is this: what new form of struggle was going to rise from those ashes?